You ever get that feeling where the air just turns heavy, like you're walking through invisible static? That's how it started. Look, I'm an IT guy, Silvester Thorne. I spend my life in Miami dealing with logic, server racks, and binary code. If it isn't a 1 or a 0, it usually doesn't exist to me. But last July, I needed to get away from the humidity and the screens, so I flew out to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. I wanted the big timber, the deep greens, and the kind of quiet you can't find in South Florida. I'm a big guy. I spend 5 days a week in the gym, so I figured I could handle a solo trek through the Pacific Northwest without a hitch. It was a Tuesday when I hiked in, about 6 miles past the last trailhead. The sky was a flat bruised gray, cloudy, but with that weird summer heat that feels like a damp wool blanket. By 4 p.m., the woods went dead. And I don't mean quiet, I mean dead. No birds, no squirrels, not even the buzz of a mosquito. It was like the forest had collectively decided to hold its breath. Why would everything go silent at once? What makes 1,000 square miles of wilderness just stop? I felt that zigzag itch in my brain, the feeling that something was unfinished, an equation that wouldn't balance. I set up camp near a shallow creek. As I was hammering in my last tent stake, I smelled it. It wasn't the smell of a bear or a wet dog. It was the stench of old copper and rotting cabbage, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I stood up, hand instinctively drifting to the 9mm Glock I keep on my chest rig. I'm not a gun nut, but when you're 20 miles from the nearest cell tower, you carry insurance. I scanned the tree line, my heart knocking against my ribs like a trapped bird. That's when I saw the first movement. About 50 yards out, behind the massive Douglas fir, something shifted. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in fur that looked like scorched earth. At first, I thought grizzly, but then it stepped out. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace that no bear possesses. It had the haunchness of a wolf, but it was standing on 2 legs. Its knees bent slightly forward. The arms were too long, ending in hands, actual hands, with dark, curved claws. I froze. My logical brain was screaming that this was an optical illusion, a trick of the cloudy light. But then, it turned its head. The muzzle was elongated, the ears pointed and set high on the skull. And those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were amber, glowing with a terrifying, intelligent malice. I'd heard the stories of the forums, the Dogman sightings in the deep woods, but I'd always loved them off as creepypasta for people who don't get out enough. Seeing it was different. Seeing it was like looking at a glitch in reality that shouldn't be possible. Yet, there it was, watching me. It didn't growl, it didn't charge, it just stared at me for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 30 seconds. Then it let out a sound, a low rhythmic clicking, like someone snapping dry twigs together inside their throat. It was mocking me. It knew I was an outsider. It knew I didn't belong in its house. Slowly, it backed into the shadows, the foliage barely rustling as it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, the Glock in my lap, listening to the sound of something heavy circling my camp over and over, just outside the reach of my lantern's light. The sun didn't so much rise as the world just turned a slightly lighter shade of charcoal. I packed my gear with trembling hands, my ears ringing from the lack of sleep and the absolute crushing silence of the woods. You ever try to pack a rucksack when you're convinced eyes are boring holes into the back of your neck? It took me twice as long because I kept spinning around, pistol raised, aiming at shadows that turned out to be just gnarled cedar trunks. I decided right then, forget the 5-day trek. I was heading back to the trailhead, back to my rental car, and back to the neon lights of Miami, where the only things that hunt you have badges or death. I started hiking south, pushing my pace. My legs, usually reliable from miles on the treadmill, felt like lead. About 2 miles in, I realized I wasn't alone. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I'd hear a subtle thump-thump from the ridge to my left. It was flanking me. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was hurting me. Why wouldn't it just attack if it wanted to? Why play with the prey? That's the thing about the Dogman lore. They say these things are ambush predators, but they are also intelligent enough to enjoy the psychological break of their target. I was the target, and I was breaking. Around noon, I stumbled onto a small clearing where a massive cedar had been uprooted by a previous storm. Sitting right on top of the root ball was a gift, or a warning. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. It hadn't been eaten by a cougar or a bear, it had been dismantled. The ribcage was pulled open like a set of French doors, and the head was gone, replaced by a neat pile of river stones. I felt my stomach flip. This was a marker. It was a boundary line I had already crossed. "Hey," I shouted, the word sounding thin and pathetic against the ancient trees. "I'm leaving. Just let me go." My voice echoed once and then died. In response, a low, guttural chuffing sound came from the dense brush not 20 feet away. It sounded like a heavy-duty air compressor cycling. Then, a tree, a sapling, about 4 inches thick, just snapped. Not from wind, but from a hand. I saw the dark furred limb reach out, grip the wood, and twist it until it splintered like a toothpick. I didn't wait. I broke into a dead sprint. I know you're not supposed to run from predators, but logic goes out the window when you see a 4-inch tree snapped by a thumb. My heavy boots thudded against the soft loam. I could hear it coming after me, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for stealth. It was faster. God, it was so much faster. Every few strides, I could hear its claws clicking against the exposed basalt rocks. I reached a steep ravine and practically tumbled down the side, sliding through thorns and loose shale, desperate to put some distance between us. I landed at the bottom, gasping, my shirt torn and my arm bleeding. But for a second, it was quiet again. Was I safe? Or was I just deeper in its trap? I stayed down in that ravine for what felt like hours. my lungs burning and my pulse hammering in my ears. The grey clouds above seemed to sink lower, squeezing the daylight out of the canyon. I checked my Glock. The slide was dusty, but it was ready. As an IT guy, I'm used to troubleshooting systems, finding the point of failure and fixing it. But how do you troubleshoot a 7-foot apex predator that defies biology? I started moving down the creek bed, hoping the water would mask my scent or at least lead me toward the trailhead. Then I heard it, a human scream. It was sharp, terrified, and cut off with a sickening wet thud. My survival instinct told me to run the other way, but I couldn't just leave someone. I scrambled up the opposite bank, my gym-trained muscles screaming as I pulled myself over a ledge. In a small hollow shadowed by ancient hemlocks, I saw them. 2 hikers, a man and a woman, backed against the rock face. They looked like they'd been through a meat grinder. The man was holding a bear spray canister like a holy relic, but his hands were shaking so hard the orange safety tab was rattling. Standing between them and their only exit was the creature. Up close, it was even more grotesque. The fur was matted with old blood and pine resin, and the muscles in its shoulders shifted like pythons under the skin. It was ripping, not just attacking but systematically destroying their gear, shredding a backpack with a single swipe of its claws, just to show them how easy it was. It was a display of pure, arrogant power. "Hey, over here, you bastard!" I yelled, leveling my Glock. The creature snapped its head toward me, its ears pinned back against its skull. It let out a sound that wasn't a bark or a howl. It was a deep chest, vibrating roar that felt like a physical blow. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. 3 rounds of 10mm hard-cast ammo. I saw the fur bunch up on its shoulder where the bullets hit. It flinched, a high-pitched yelp escaping its muzzle, and it scrambled back into the darkness of the trees with terrifying speed. "Get up, we have to move," I shouted to the hikers. The man, Mark, and the woman, Sarah, were in shock. Sarah had a deep gash on her leg, but she could walk. We formed a desperate phalanx, me in the rear with a gun, Mark in front with a heavy survival knife he'd pulled from his belt. We were 3 miles from the car, and the sun was finally starting to dip below the horizon. In the Pacific Northwest, when the sun goes down, the woods don't just get dark, they turn into an inkwell. And in that ink, something was circling us, huffing in a rhythmic mocking cadence that told us it was far from finished. We didn't walk, we moved in a frantic, stumbling shuffle, our flashlights cutting pathetic yellow holes into the encroaching blackness. The Dogman wasn't hiding anymore. It was parallel to us, snapping thick branches and letting out that horrific clicking sound every few yards. Every time I swung my light toward the noise, I'd catch the reflection of those amber eyes, wide, unblinking, and closer than they were 30 seconds ago. Why was it waiting? Was it a gun? Or was it waiting for us to reach a specific spot? That's when the trail opened up into the final stretch of old-growth timber before the parking lot. Suddenly, the forest exploded. The creature didn't come from the side, it dropped from a low-hanging limb of a cedar right in front of us. It landed with a heavy thud that I felt in my teeth. In the direct beam of my light, the Dogman looked like a nightmare sculptured from wet earth and shadow. It lunged at Mark. Sarah screamed as the creature's claws raked across Mark's arm, shredding his jacket and skin like wet tissue paper. I didn't have a clear shot without hitting him, so I did the only thing a Miami IT guy knows how to do when a system crashes. I forced a hard reset. I charged. I'm a 230 pounds of gym-fed muscle, and I threw every bit of it into a shoulder check against the creature's midsection. It was like hitting a brick wall covered in coarse hair. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but it bought Mark a second to roll away. I scrambled back, drawing the Glock and emptying the rest of the magazine into the dirt at the creature's feet. The muzzle flashes were blinding, the thunderous boom 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 echoing off the trees like cannon fire. The sheer noise and the stinging spray of dirt seemed to confuse it, a momentary glitch in its predatory instinct. "Run! The car!" I roared, my voice cracking. We bolted. We didn't look back, even when we heard the creature let out a high-pitched metallic shriek behind us. We burst into the gravel parking lot, the sight of my silver rental SUV looking like a palace of safety. I fumbled the key fob, the locks clicking open just as a massive shape cleared the tree line 50 feet away. We piled in, Sarah in the back, Mark bleeding in the passenger seat, and me behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a roar, and I slammed it into reverse just as a heavy weight slammed into the rear hatch, shattering the back window. I didn't stop. I floored it down the Forest Service road, the tires screaming on the gravel, the shattered glass rattling in the frame. In the rearview mirror, for one brief second, I saw it standing in the middle of the road, under the faint glow of the moon. It wasn't chasing us anymore. It was standing perfectly still, watching us leave, its head tilted to the side like a curious dog. We made it to the hospital in Olympia 2 hours later. The doctor said Mark was lucky to keep his arm. The police said it was a rogue bear, and wrote a report they clearly didn't believe. I'm back in Miami now, surrounded by screens and logic. But every time I hear a dog bark or the wind clicks a branch against my window, I'm back in those woods. I know the truth. Some things in the dark aren't just animals. They're the things that animals are afraid of.